In the first part of this series that we began last week, we considered how biblical prophecy requires 100% accuracy. And that is because it is linked to the very nature of God in that he is both eternal and omnipotent. And we looked closely at the passage in Isaiah 9:6 with the prophecy of a son who would be born and who would also be God himself. And today we're going to consider our consideration of prophecy by taking a look at first at some of the people who claimed that they matched the prophetic portrait of the Messiah. The first one is the man by the name of Simon Bar Kokhba, and this was in the 2nd century AD. So this is only about 100 years after the death of Yeshua, and also 62 years after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And Bar Kokhba at that time led the second Jewish revolt against Rome. They had some initial success, and that stirred up Messianic expectations among the Jewish community. Rabbi Akiva, who was the leading Jewish scholar at that time in the 2nd century, he heralded Bar Kokhba as being the Messiah, in part because Bar Kokhba meant son of a star. And Akiva said that that was the fulfillment of Balaam's oracle in the book of Numbers, chapter 24, verse 17, which stated, "There shall come a star out of Jacob." So I want to show you an artistic rendering of the time of Bar Kokhba, and this idea right here. And this is one of the elements that's on the menorah that is across the street from the Knesset in Jerusalem. And it has all these different facets of Jewish history on that menorah. And this is the picture of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and you can see a shooting star going across the top of the image there in recognition of his name, and the fact that Rabbi Akiva said that this was the reason that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. That was the basis that he used, ignoring some fairly significant other Messianic prophecies, but this was the one that was good enough for Akiva to call him the Messiah. Unfortunately, Bar Kokhba, this false Messiah, failed to bring about the kingdom, and tragically 600,000 Jewish people perished. And virtually the entire Jewish world was purged out of the land of Judea at that time. Previously, only the temple had been destroyed, but all the villages and so on were left intact. But now it was devoid of Jews. And it was because of this heralding of a false Messiah that had a part in that. Then we move forward to the 5th century AD, where a fellow comes along by the name of Moses, and he was in Crete, so he's called Moses of Crete. And as he traveled around that Greek island, he convinced the Jewish people that he was the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 18:18, that says that God would raise up a prophet that was reckoned to be the Messiah, that would be just like Moses himself. And so because he convinced himself that he was just like Moses, he promised to lead the Jewish people of the island of Crete all the way back to the land of Israel. So he led the people to the edge of the seashore, and then he declared that he would cause it to part just like the biblical Moses that is depicted here in this picture. And so he raised his arms over his head, just like Moses, and commanded the people to jump into the sea off this cliff. And that's exactly what they did. Yeah. Obediently, that's what they did. But unlike the biblical account from the book of Exodus, the sea did not part, and a great number of those people drowned in the ocean. And those that survived pursued this second Moses, although he was able to escape and was never heard from again. Other messiahs followed, most notably Shabbatai Tzvi in Turkey in the 1600s. He had a really captivating personality, and he was an expert in Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism. At the age of 22, he heard an inner voice declaring, "You are the Redeemer of Israel." And he connected with another Jew by the name of Nathan, who was also a devotee of Kabbalah. Nathan fell into a trance during a large gathering of Jews there in Turkey and declared to them that Shabbatai was the Messiah. This was followed by reports that Shabbatai was predicting when people would die, and that he had also passed through a big bonfire 3 different times without actually getting burned. Now, never mind that those are not characteristics of the Messiah according to Scripture. Word spread quickly and excitement grew in the Jewish communities. His followers began acclaiming him as the King Messiah, again depicted in this artwork here of that time. The Turks, however, had another idea. They came up with a solution because they saw him as a threat to the well-being of the Ottoman Empire. And so the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire told Shabbatai he had 2 choices. You can either die as a martyr or you can convert to Islam. So this would-be Messiah chose to live. And so he became a Muslim as a result, and actually convinced a number of his Jewish followers also to convert to Islam. And you can actually see Shabbatai's tomb in the country of Montenegro today. In modern times, of course, we have the deceased leader of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, Menachem Mendel Schneerson. He may have died in 1994, but many of his disciples still believe that he is the Messiah and will return one day. And the reason that their reasons for believing that he is the Messiah are not very strong, to be honest with you. They say that he was a righteous man, so that qualifies him to be the Messiah. And there was an occasion where they actually, his disciples, sang a song to him that acclaimed him to be the Messiah, and he let them sing it. Okay, I'm giving you all the evidence of why Schneerson was the Messiah. That is one of the things that they mention. And Schneerson actually did proclaim that God had revealed to him that the Messiah would announce that redemption for Israel would be announced from the roof of the Lubavitch headquarters in Brooklyn. He didn't say that he was the Messiah, but the people were connecting the dots. And so today, many of his followers are waiting for that announcement to be realized. So we might ask ourselves, how is it that over so many centuries that so many Jewish people have been duped by these wannabe messiahs? There seems to be a great disparity between the biblical portrait of the Messiah and the individuals who have been embraced historically as the anointed one. In each case, the evidence just seems to be marginal at best. So those events also shed some light on the modern day tendency among Jews, especially within the Reformed community, to reject the concept of the Messiah as a person altogether. It seems to be less embarrassing and much more acceptable to believe in a coming Messianic age. After all, it is very popular today to be drawn towards anything that promotes peace and harmony. So converting the Messiah into a metaphor makes that much easier. Yet there is a third alternative. We can know what the scriptures have to say about the Messiah and then compare that portrait to any and everyone who is heralded at the Messiah. I think that that is the right thing to do because it connects to God's message and his original intent, rather than coming up with our own ideas. So we have to have the complete facts. And then it seems reasonable to me that we should then be able to conclude what the truth is of the matter, to make meaningful decisions for ourselves. So in part one of this series, I'm going to show you here what we addressed then. We saw how Messianic prophecy can be classified in three ways. Last time we talked about direct prophecies, and we looked in particular at one in Isaiah 9:6, in which the text literally declares a coming son would be the mighty God dwelling on earth. And today we're going to consider another passage that is a foreshadow prophecy. And this is also in the book of Isaiah. So this is a prediction that has implications for both the immediate time frame in which they were given and for an even greater event to come. So this passage that we're going to look at in Isaiah chapter 7 does that very thing. And in particular, verse 14, Isaiah 7:14 is the key verse to that. But I want to begin by looking at the way that Matthew writes about this verse in his gospel, about the manner of the birth of Yeshua, saying in Matthew 1:22 and 3, now all this took place to fulfill what was spoken by Adonai through the prophet, speaking of Isaiah. Behold, the virgin shall be with child and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which translated means God with us. So the virgin birth of Yeshua is a fundamental Christian or a Messianic belief. But Judaism teaches that this is a false understanding of the words of Isaiah. And to be honest, that would mean, if that is true, that this is a false understanding, that would mean that not only the book of Matthew, but the entire New Testament is fraudulent. In other words, if Matthew is wrong, then countless believers in Yeshua have been believing a lie. That's how significant this is. The rabbis would never say that publicly, that all of Christianity is a fraud, because they want to play nice. But if you are honest and logical about it, this is the ultimate conclusion. Either we are believing the truth or we are believing a lie. And so it seems wise to me that we should be able to become adequately informed so that we can make a proper decision for ourselves, as I've been saying here a number of times. Now, in order to understand the meaning of Isaiah's prophecy, we first need to know the context of that verse. It is a context that actually begins in the book of Genesis. A key foundational story in Scripture has to do with the promises that God made to Abraham, especially regarding a nation and a redeemer that would arise from him in a physical sense. The only problem was that when God made the initial promise to Abraham, it was physically impossible for that to happen, because God declared that it could only happen through Abram's wife Sarai, who was later changed to Sarah. And so let's take a look at Genesis chapter 17. Genesis 17:16, God speaking says, I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Now, when Adonai declared those words, this was an impossibility. The words that I just read there were an absolute impossibility when you consider the fact that she was 90 years old and that she had never been able to conceive up to that point in her life. Impossible. Throughout human history, there is no record of a woman who was infertile suddenly becoming capable of bearing a child at the very advanced state of age. And Abraham realized this too, and he thought the promise would have to be fulfilled through Ishmael, which was kind of a human solution to this. God said that After Abraham said that it would be through Ishmael, God said, no, but Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. So what could you say at that point? God had made it very, very clear that it was not going to happen in a natural kind of way. It was a total impossibility. Such a thing could only happen through a miracle. But such a thing could happen when the omnipotent creator of the universe is involved. 1 year later, the miraculous did happen when Sarah gave birth to Isaac. A child was born to a woman who was 100% physically incapable of doing so without God's intervention. The impossible came true, and a precedent was set. Fast forward now many generations. The people of Israel arose from that one miraculous birth. Then, after the death of King Solomon, the nation divided into two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. 200 years later, after Solomon, the nation of Assyria was ruled by an aggressive king by the name of Tiglath-Pileser III, who was known for his brutality. You see that depicted in this artistic rendering here, where he's got his head on the back of a neck of someone who's a subject to him. Brutal kind of a guy. His objective was to expand Assyrian territory by devouring smaller kingdoms on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. In 735 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel was on the verge of being Assyria's victim, as well as the kingdom of Aram, which was also called Damascus. At that time, Ahaz, as we might say in the English, became the kingdom of Judah in the southern part there, and he was 20 years old at that time. Shortly after, Rezin, who was the king of Aram, and Pekah, who was the king of Israel, attempted to force Ahaz into an alliance, so that if Aram, Israel, and Judah aligned together as one, they could resist the forces of Assyria coming from the north. So Aram and Israel were already convinced that they were going to do that. Judah was the holdout, and Ahaz, this king, was the reason for that. He was a holdout. So perhaps due to his immaturity, Ahaz became fearful and had difficulty trusting Adonai to stand against those kingdoms. So he began scheming for a political solution. As a result of his lack of trust in the God of his forefathers, Adonai then sent the prophet Isaiah to confront the king, dealing with his lack of faith. Isaiah chapter 7 tells this story. When God called, interesting, at the very beginning of the chapter, you can notice, when God called Isaiah to go and confront Ahaz, he also told Isaiah to take along with him his son, whose name was Sha'ar-Yeshuv. Sha'ar-Yeshuv means a remnant will return, which is one of those great biblical names that you could give to a child. But God told Isaiah to take your son along with you. So we should be thinking, why would he do that? God does not do anything without a purpose behind it. And this will play a part in the prophecy that is at hand. Isaiah then goes to the king, and he admonishes Ahaz, telling him not to be fearful. And sensing that this was a spiritual battle of faith, Isaiah gives this warning to him in Isaiah 7:9. If you will not believe, you surely shall not last. And he's talking here very specifically about believing in Adonai to be the one who will solve all of their problems that they were facing. The next step that God gave to Isaiah to communicate to Ahaz was to challenge him to request Adonai to give him a sign, because he's dealing with his lack of faith. Just ask Adonai for a sign. That's the purpose here. So that's what we see in verse 10. Then Adonai spoke again to Ahaz, saying, ask a sign for yourself from Adonai your God. Make it as deep as Sheol, the grave, or as high as heaven. That great span of possibilities. Can you picture that range? It goes infinitely in one direction and in the other direction. It is a figure of speech that gives him boundless options. You can ask anything. Now, he could have said something like, how about everybody in the kingdom becomes happy with me as the king? That would be a great sign, right? But you see, the problem is that wouldn't be big enough. He needs an even bigger kind of a sign. How big could he go? He could have said to Adonai, okay, God, come on down to this earth and prove to me that you are God. You fix all the problems of not just that I'm facing here, you fix all of the problems of the world. He could have said that. He could have actually requested such a sign. It was within the range of possibilities, as deep as Sheol and as high as the heavens. The point is that Ahaz was given the opportunity to request virtually anything that had never happened before. But if he was to do that, that would meant then that he would have to acknowledge Adonai as being legitimately the true God. And that would mean taking away his own power. And Ahaz wasn't interested in any kind of a spiritual solution involving the God of his forefathers. He wanted to do it his own way. So in verse 12, Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test Adonai. So instead, he intended to come up with his own solution, as I said. We later learn in 2 Kings that Ahaz ended up cutting a deal with Tilgath-Pileser by making Judah a vassal state under the umbrella power of Assyria. He didn't align with Israel and Aram. He went around them to the big power of Assyria, cutting his own deal. And that was a very tragic thing to do. So this then freed up Assyria to come and to move on Aram. And within 3 years, he conquered Damascus and took their people captive. And a short time after that, he took captive all of the people of the kingdom of Israel. And that's how Judah managed to survive, is because Judah sold out Israel, their own people. It's a very tragic thing. Ahaz at that time also went to Damascus, because after Assyria got there, they brought their own religious system. They set up a temple there in Damascus. Ahaz went to Damascus to see this temple that they had built there. And he decided that he wanted to have the very same thing there at home in Jerusalem. And so he built a temple, a structure for worshiping here, the god Baal there in Jerusalem at that time. And he also then engaged in divination at the altar and many other ungodly practices. In fact, he incorporated the most heinous of all ungodly practice by burning to death his own children sacrificially on the altar. This is the slippery slope of abandoning the true God. All of this came about after Ahaz rejected Adonai as the sovereign Lord here in this passage that we're considering in Isaiah chapter 7. This is the turning point in his life. The opportunity to behold Adonai at work was lost because he did not have the will to ask Adonai for a sign that was assuredly available to him. But in spite of the loss that was experienced by Ahaz, the sign itself would not be lost. So let's take a look at the passage once again. Isaiah declared under divine inspiration in verse 14, "Therefore, Adonai himself will give you a sign." So this is when it is important to pay attention, close attention to the actual original Hebrew of the text. In English, we use the exact same word you, Y-O-U, for a singular person or for plural. So it's much more of an ambiguous term. But Hebrew grammar makes a very sharp distinction. It is not very readily apparent in our English translations regarding this verse, but it is clear in the Hebrew. In this verse, instead of using the singular form of you, lacha, he uses the plural form of the word, lachem. This means that it would be a sign not just for the rebellious king, but for a much larger audience. Who might that be? Well, all you do is back up one verse to verse 13. It says, "Listen now, O house of David." He's talking about the Jewish people here. It would be a sign to the Jewish people related to the divine promises given through the lineage of David. This is the key. Someone is going to descend from David who's going to be involved in this sign. It's a reference to the Messiah, the ultimate King of Israel and Son of David, through the tribe and kingdom of Judah. So that is the first clue that this is going to be a very unique kind of sign. It would not just be a sign that would be emphasizing trusting in God, but it would have messianic implications. And as a sign that is as deep as Sheol and as high as the heaven, it would have an incomparable impact. This then is the full context of the verse that follows. So Isaiah continues in verse 14 by describing the sign. "Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel." Well, the key to understanding this sign is the meaning of the Hebrew word alma, translated here as virgin. So let us consider if this particular interpretation, this translation, is true. Is that what alma is getting at? In modern Jewish translations of the Tanakh, the Old Testament, alma is translated as maiden or young woman. So if I were to quote from the Tanakh in the according to the Jewish Publication Society, for example, it says, "Look, the young woman is with child and about to give birth to a son. Let her name him Emmanuel." That's a very different kind of implication now, doesn't it? The rabbis point out that there is another word, that is betulah, that describes physical virginity. But Isaiah didn't use that word here. So therefore, this is not about a virgin. That's what they will tell you. And you see, if you don't know the answer to that particular claim, you cannot win. Because they're going to have the upper hand, because they're going to have the Hebrew angle down. But are they right? Is it right that Judaism teaches that the virgin birth of Yeshua is a false doctrine? That really is the question here. So which is it? What is the correct meaning behind the word used to describe the woman of this sign, this Alma? Let me give you 4 reasons why Isaiah 7:14 foretells the virgin birth. First is that Alma never refers to a married woman. Alma comes from a root alam that conveys hidden potential. That's what that word is all about. It's a very interesting word. It has hidden potential. Or to put it another way, it means that you are capable of doing something, but you are not out in the open to do it. It is depicted rather clearly in the Islamic culture, which is still associated with the practices of the ancient Near East, in the way that women are veiled, so that by their stature you can ascertain their maturity, but not their personal experience or their availability. That's the idea here. Hidden potential. So with this root meaning of capability without being eligible to act on it, we need to consider the greater context of Scripture where Alma is used. And altogether, Alma is used 9 additional times in Scripture. I've given you here the full list of every place where Alma is used in Scripture. In every single one of these cases, the passage refers to a young woman of physical maturity, but none of them are married. So none of them would be eligible to give birth to a child. So thus, we could say an Alma was capable, though not yet eligible to bear children. That's what the word itself implies. Now we have to look at culture. In the culture of Israel, a maiden, an Alma, was not sexually active. So even if you would translate it as maiden or young woman, you would have to say that she would not have been sexually active at that point in time. See, part of the difficulty that we have in understanding things of a biblical context is trying to view them through our own cultural lenses. In our present day, young, unmarried men and women are not automatically assumed to be virgins. In fact, the opposite is likely the norm. But in biblical days, a maiden, a young woman who was capable of becoming pregnant, would not ever be sexually active. To do so would diminish the worth of a bride in a culture in which marriageable daughters were more like a valuable commodity. Whenever a father would give permission to another father for his son to marry the first father's daughter, the groom and his family would have to pay what's called a mohar, which is like a form of a dowry. And that would go then to the family of the bride. And so as you can imagine, a young woman who became sexually active before marriage would cause the value of the mohar to drop considerably. So to violate one's virginity would be an economic tragedy, let alone bringing shame upon the family. So there was tremendous social pressure for unmarried young women to remain chaste. And that is why we can say with great confidence that if you do have a reference to an Alma, that woman would never have had sex at that point in time. Thus we can say that every Alma was a virgin, unless stated otherwise. Thirdly, the Septuagint translation uses the Greek word for a physical virgin, parthenos. Now, when Matthew quoted from Isaiah 7:14 as the fulfillment of prophecy, his source was the Septuagint. What is the Septuagint? It's the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek that was made 200 years before Yeshua. Well, because those the Septuagint is based on the number 70. There were 72 Jewish scholars who translated the Hebrew into Greek. And because they understood just exactly what Isaiah was getting at here, the nature of his prophecy, without any kind of Christian influence, because it's 200 years before Yeshua, their choice of an equivalent Greek word to the Hebrew alma was parthenos, which very clearly depicts physical virginity. And the reason that they could make that decision is because they had a solid grasp of the overall implications of an alma being a virgin and how it is used in the Hebrew text. The fourth reason is that the nature of the prophecy was something impossible coming true. A young woman giving birth, that would be rather ordinary, although it would have to be within the context of marriage. But a woman giving birth and she had never been sexually active, now that would be a sign. It is easy to overlook an important element of this prophecy in the midst of the controversy of the virgin birth, that the child being born to this woman would be known as Emmanuel, meaning God with us. This meaning, in conjunction with a great observable sign, is a description of the most intimate way that God could ever possibly be with humanity. He would dwell among humanity in human form. For some people, that seems like an impossibility. God could never do that, could he? Well, I would say, yeah, he could. After all, he declared, "Is anything too difficult for me?" He is indeed the God of the impossible. It is totally within his power and his stated will to actually become our Redeemer. Not just to send a human being to do the task, to get it done himself. And who greater could he rely upon than himself? And in that regard, it really isn't impossible at all. So when we look closely at the text, we can see that Adonai inspired Isaiah to use this moment in history, in Isaiah chapter 7, to unveil something that would have tremendous impact, and a revelation of an even greater plan that God had for not just these nations that are striving with one another at the time, but also for the entire world, that he has a greater plan in mind. He shifted the focus to the entire nation, all of the Jewish people, by declaring that an impossible sign would be given to them, one as deep as Sheol and as high as heaven. And what was that? A woman who was physically and socially unable to give birth would do exactly that. And we later learn that it was the Ruach HaKodesh, the Spirit of God, that would cause it to happen, as he is surely capable of doing. And that the child would be known as Emmanuel, reflecting the fact that God had always intended to dwell among people and to bring about his plan of redemption through the Messiah. This is consistent with what we considered last time with Isaiah's prophecy in chapter 9, and it is consistent with the miraculous and impossible birth of Isaac to Sarah long before. Context, people. You got to consider the context. And so this is truly a great sign then for all people. But notice that it is in particular given to the Jewish people. The Jewish people need to be looking at this very, very closely. As the story in Isaiah chapter 7 continues, The prophet then goes on to say that Ahaz would also get a sign for him personally. And the grammar shifts back to the second person singular, you, in verse 16. He's not talking to the house of Israel. He's talking to the king of Israel at that time, one singular person. That's in verse 16. And the subject of the sign shifts to Isaiah's own son, Sha'ar Yeshuv, who's been standing right next to him all of this time while this dialogue is going on. Now that Isaiah had given the prophetic sign for the future event involving the virgin birth of the Messiah, he then uses his own son as the sign for the immediate circumstances. Isaiah prophetically tells Ahaz that before this boy, standing right next to him, reaches maturity, the confederation of Isaiah and Aram would fall to Assyria. And indeed, that is the case. If you look at the chronology, that just within that short period of time, those nations would fall, and then Sha'ar Yeshuv, this son, would then have reached about the age of 12. Got to read the scriptures in context. This is the way that a foreshadow prophecy works in the Bible. God foretold through the prophet Isaiah that an event would occur in his day that would also then be a precursor for an even greater event to occur in a later day. Only when considered in the biblical and historical context, this controversial verse in Isaiah 7:14 makes sense. As Abraham and Sarah discovered long ago, as Isaiah foretold and Ahaz rejected, as Matthew confirmed, and as Yeshua fulfilled, nothing is impossible with God. He accomplishes things that we could never dream up on our own, and he faithfully brings them to pass exactly as he intends. Moreover, we need to recognize that calling the Son Emmanuel in Isaiah's prophecy is no minor detail. Kind of gets lost in the shuffle for some people here. Get the focus on the virgin part, and it's just like, I don't want to consider any of the rest. It reflects God's great desire to have a personal relationship with humanity, including you and me. Yeshua, the only one who could ever match Isaiah's description, along with many other prophecies that we'll be considering in this series. Unlike these false messiahs who couldn't even come close to fulfilling Messianic prophecy, Yeshua alone is the manifestation of God's desire to dwell with humanity. He is our Emmanuel, God dwelling with us. And because he was able to accomplish redemption for all humanity in a perfect way, he now enables us to dwell with God in the world to come. He will be Emmanuel forever and ever and ever. Without him, without Yeshua, that is humanly impossible, dwelling with God in the world to come. But through him, through Yeshua, the impossible becomes true.